Hello everyone. This is a little different video than what I normally put out. One of my viewers had requested I do a flapping video of the days gone by, which I do enjoy doing, and with the way things are in this world and in this country now, looking back on the old days means more now to me than it ever did. Now, there wasn't a lot of excitement and a lot of things that I've done years ago that really are that important to probably a lot of you. However, at the risk of repeating myself, which I probably will because I am going from memory, I am not showing my ugly kisser. I'm not going to show a dirty sponge, a shop sponge. I'm going to try to put some photos up here. The problem I'm having is, back in those days, there was very little photography on my part. I didn't start taking pictures until around 1960 or so. So anything before that was done by my mom with her 620 roll film camera, cheap camera, black and white. And I'm not going to, there's only a couple of pictures of my mom and dad. There's no point in putting those up there. I have shared some photos that were taken in the 50s of my uncle and my cousin and so on and so forth. So primarily, like I say, one of my viewers wanted me to share. He enjoyed the hygienic good old times, and I may touch base on that again without trying to repeat too much of what I've already said. Now, there's a lot of you viewers out there that may not have seen these videos. You may be new to my channel, and I try to give a variety of videos, and I try not to do too much of one thing, although it does happen that way, mainly because of the weather and so forth. So I do a lot of electronic videos. So what I want to do now is, and as I said, I may be repeating myself, and I'm going strictly unscripted from this gray matter which is drying up, in other words, my brain. So nothing is written down. There may not even be any proper order at which I am going to discuss things. I am going to put up some photos, and the problem I'm having, as I started to say, and I got sidetracked a little bit here, is there was no real photos back in the days when I lived in New Haven for a while and stuff like that. So a few of these photos were taken off of the internet. Some were taken from other videos, and hopefully there isn't going to be a copyright problem with that. So I'm going to be showing some photos while I am talking, and you'll probably be seeing them now. None of the photos may be related to the conversation. For me to be able to sync all them in there is impossible for me. I cannot do that. I'm not a professional video editing goat. Okay? I am sitting in my workshop now with my Tascam TR05. And this audio track will be overlaid on the videos, which are going to be photos only. And the photos you're going to see are not necessarily going to be what I am talking about. It's just something to look at, okay, rather than to look at my ugly kisser all the time, which is not a pleasant sight. Okay, so let's get started on this. Trying to go from memory here. So the first photo that you are going to see is a photo that I got from Google Earth of the house that I was born in 1943. 20 Forest Road in West Haven, Connecticut. To this day, as of maybe a couple of years ago when I took that photo from Google Earth, the building is still there, looks exactly the same. That is the house, which you're no doubt seeing on the screen now, and I have to remember to put these into a proper order, and I'm going to do the best I can. So that's where my mom and dad and where I was born, December 7th, 1943. 20 Forest Road in West Haven, Connecticut. Just a little ways down from that house in West Haven, at the corner of Forest, and I don't remember the intersection main drag, was the Forest Theater, which in one of these photos that I got off the internet, showing the theater before it was destroyed by demolition. The following photo shows it sadly being destroyed. It's a heartbreak. I have never been to that theater. Remember, I was born on 20 Forest Road in West Haven. However, in my teenage years when we were living in New Haven, I did take the bus which went by the Forest Theater to visit my Aunt Eva, my Uncle Chris, and my grandma. So I have seen the Forest Theater many times, but like I say, I have never been in it. Okay, so now that we started out with where this old fossil was born, and I have never shown that before on video, we're going to jump around a little bit. Now, going back probably maybe in the 60s or so, like I say, I'm going to be jumping around quite a bit, and nothing's going to be in order, because I'm going strictly from memory, and you know my memory, it's not all that good these days. So, back in the mid-50s, we lived up here in Connecticut. My dad built a house in 55, added on to it, and you have seen those photos. So you may not see them on this video here. You'll probably be seeing mostly scenery, photos maybe from New Hampshire, which I always enjoy looking at mountain scenery. It's so relaxing. And so that's probably what I'll do, but I will occasionally pop in a photo if I can of other things. Now, around 1959, my dad sold that house to a realtor, turned it over to a realtor, and that was a big mistake, but my father was a self-employed landscape gardener. He did everything by hand. No tractors, no. About the most he would have is he would rent a rototiller to churn up the ground, and he did all that, and he would plant, lawns, and he would do everything by himself. I was about 12 or 13 years old in middle 50s. And he would take me to the landscape job, of course, when I was not going in school, so it would usually be on a weekend. And I, even back then, hated the hot sun. I got to a point where my dad really didn't want to take me out because I didn't want to stay too long. It was too hot. So heat is something I could never take, even although I was more tolerant of it back when I was a kid, but I don't like the heat. Of course, when we went to school, there was no such thing as air conditioning, in the schools, that is. There were air conditioners, of course, but in the schools I went to, they did not have AC, but they did have fans, and we managed and tolerated it without any problems. When you're young, you can tolerate that much more. So in 59, as I said, my father sold the house. My mom and dad and my sister and my brother. My sister passed on. She was 2 years younger than me. She died quite a few years back of cancer. So her name was Valerie. And when she died, she was living up in Tilton, New Hampshire with a live-in fella. They used to have tables out and sold things like a flea market thing. They would buy things and sell things, But she was up in New Hampshire when she passed on. So, it was kind of tough, although my sister and I weren't all that close, but nonetheless, that's the story there. We moved to New Haven, and we moved to an apartment, a 4-family apartment building at 1272 State Street in New Haven, Connecticut. It's funny how I remember that, but that is the start, or was the start, of my electronics hobby. Before that, I used to, I was interested in it in the mid-50s, but didn't really start doing anything until I moved to New Haven in 59. So what I did when we moved there, I made it, and I'm repeating myself, I know, on this particular part of it, but a lot of you may not have heard it. In New Haven, back in those days, 59 and 60, back when Nixon was debating with Khrushchev, I remember that, and so anyways, I used to make a point to go to every television and radio repair shop that I could walk to. I wasn't driving then. I was 16 years old in 59. And pick their brains, so to speak. Now, I was already getting books from the New Haven Public Library on radio, electronics, and stuff like that. So I was already doing that because I'd walk to the library because we lived on State Street. It wasn't too far. And I did a lot of walking back then. I only weighed 127 pounds. I was a bag of bones like I am now. But I have to admit that the last time I got weighed, I'm 159. Probably I lost another 10 pounds for all I know. I don't know. We can't go to the doctors anymore because of this corona crap. But anyways, I'm trying to bring back some fond memories and trying to forget about this horrible world we're living in now. So, anyways, so I used to go to all the television shops, and there were quite a few television and radio repair shops. Almost, I wouldn't say every corner, but there was quite a few of these shops wherever you go. And there was a lot of second-hand stores where you could buy radios. Because at that time, to my knowledge, a radio of the 40s and 50s and even the 30s were not even considered antique. So they were relatively readily available in a second-hand shop. So you could pick them up for dirt cheap. Consoles, $5, but I had no room and no way to carry them home. But anyways, there was a lot of television and repair shops, guys that would answer my questions, show me how to solder properly, and stuff like that. And I remember on the radio that I just restored, there were some situations where I cannot get in with the solder, holding the component lead, holding my magnifying glass and everything else. So when I have a tough situation, I have to put the solder on the iron and carry it over to the connection, because that's the only way I could do it, and tack it on. There are situations where I have to do that. But I remember that's a no-no in the electronics field, because the radio man, that's how I started soldering. I put it on the iron and carry it over to the work instead of feeding the solder in. Of course, I don't do that anymore, except if I have a tough area where it's buried right down into the work where I can't get nothing in but the iron and can't see what I'm doing. So, anyways, I'm getting off the subject a little bit, but one of the fellows that I went to showed me how to properly solder, So, and I picked their brains on stuff. Others, when I went to them, a few of them didn't really want to be bothered, and I can understand that. And I've gone to some others where they've had a chassis that they didn't want. They'd give it to me, whether it was a television or whatever. I'd bring that home, carrying it home. And, I would estimate, I'm guessing now, but it could be a mile or more walk from downtown New Haven to 1272 State Street, where we lived in that four-family tenement. Now, in that four-family tenement, we lived on the first floor, and there was 3 other apartments, one on the other side of us and 2 overhead. Each section had one quarter of the cellar. Now, back in those days when that cellar was used, there were coal bins. That's where you had your coal delivery, and there were actual coal bins down there. They were no longer used, but you had some coal dust. Not much. It was swept up. So, you got a little dirty when you go down there. But I set up a workshop down there. And even back in those days, as I said, I can't take the heat. So in a hot day, 95, 100 degrees out, I'd be downstairs in the cellar puttering around. And back in those days, I started collecting records. 45 RPM records was one of the first ones I acquired was Bobby Darin's Plain Jane. That was the very first 45 record I collected, and I started collecting in 1959. So you hear me mention a lot about 1959 because it was a very active time in my life with the electronics, with the records, and so forth. Now, I was 16 years old. I was, I had a lot of ideas, no money, just like now. I was working at W.T. Grant's, I think it's on Chapel Street, in New Haven. I'm going to try to put a picture up there, but again, this picture was taken off the internet. I believe it was taken off of a video. I hope there's not a problem with copyright. That's the problem with that. Obviously, back in those days, I did not, as I told you, take photos, let alone movies. Okay? So I have to rely on other sources to get photos of the days gone by. Okay? So I can give you kind of an idea of what things were. So I worked at W.T. Grant's in New Haven. It was right next to Woolworths, wasn't too far away, F.W. Woolworths. W.T. Grant's had a little luncheonette counter where you got small items, milkshakes and hamburgers and French fries and stuff like that. I was a dishwasher. Yes, I started my working career out as a dishwasher. I did not like that job at all. I liked working at W.T. Grant's, but I did not like that job. It was hectic. It was busy, you know. I had to keep going, and as a 16-year-old, it was tough. But I was working and supporting my family, you know, my mom and my dad, who still was doing landscaping, but he had diabetes and his health was going down, even though he was still working. So I had to work, okay? So that is the story there as far as working at W.T. Grant's, which is the only job I had in New Haven while I was living there. Now, we lived in New Haven for a few years, so I covered a lot of area and had several television chassis to work on. Now, back in those days, I've also told you that my dad used to go to, I can't remember what stores, it was a department store, where they would have a George Washington sale, birthday sale in the stores where you could get a non-working television for like 88 cents or $1. It was insanely cheap. My dad would pick these up. He'd pick up several of them, and my dad also got me into this, but he was a tube swapper, just like I was back in those days. He never got into the electronics under the chassis and so forth. So between us, on the kitchen table, we would mess around and try to get a television going. There was a situation, a time where we've had several TVs. One would not have sound and one would have sound but no picture. So we had to run two televisions in order to get both the best both sound and picture. But eventually my dad and mom got a used television. I think they picked it up from a TV shop or something. It was a metal case RCA with a flip cover. As a matter of fact, when that so-called radio and television from Bill Morris's auction, which I lost out big time on, my TV that was my mom and dad's, a picture tube was no good. I gave it to Robert of Farm Radio. Whether he ever did anything with it or not, I didn't want to see it go to the junkyard. So as far as I know, he still has it, but I doubt anything is going to ever have been done with it. So that was a 21-inch black and white TV. Now, for me, I had a little 10-inch or 12-inch Motorola television, which kept rolling, and I kept changing tubes, vertical output and oscillator tubes, but that didn't do any good because I didn't know the circuitry then. So, I was still in the infancy of the technology. So it would get to a point where I'd run the TV for about a half an hour watching a Twilight Zone episode, and then it would roll so much that I ran out of range on the vertical hold control, and I'd have to turn the TV off, let it cool down, and start the whole thing over again. So I've had several TVs. One of the TVs that I had was a Hallicrafters push-button TV, and I don't know the model number, maybe 505 or something like that. Buzz 1151 did one with a 7JP4 in it. And I had problems with that set. I was still learning. So I carried the set over to an old German guy. His last name was Zeitz. He was very knowledgeable, and he wouldn't charge me very much to fix it. And I could go over there and I'd talk to him, and he would go into the set, and he got the set going for me. He got the horizontal high voltage oscillator. They did not use flybacks. They used a high tension coil, and they oscillated at, I can't remember what the oscillating frequency is. I'm guessing about maybe 25 kc or something like that. It would be a high voltage oscillator, usually a 25L6, it's a series wired set, or something like that, would oscillate, generate the high voltage in these 6 pies. The high voltage transformer was what they call pi sections. There was 6 coils, as I recall, on it, and each one generated 1,000 volts. So they would generate 6,000 volts by way of an oscillator, and it would be rectified on a 1B3 oscillator rectifier. In other words, a 1B3 rectifier tube. And so that's how they did it. They didn't do it with flybacks. And it was a touchy circuit. Oscillator had to be just right, or it wouldn't generate high voltage. So Zeitz was he was uglier than me, and that's going some. He was a nice guy, but and he sold record cutting equipment. That was another hobby that I very briefly got into. Buying an old 78 RPM turntable, he'd have the cutting discs of the record disc. There were, I don't know what they made, shellac or what they were. They were black discs. I bought them so much. I bought a cutting cartridge with a cutting needle on it from him. And he told me how to do it. Now, normally you'd use some kind of a lathe, like a Scully lathe or something like that, which would track the arm across the record in a uniform pattern, because that's how you cut records. You got to do it with a gear-driven, or actually it was like an Acme thread type of drive on those. And the cutting head, look at it as almost like a speaker. It's a low impedance coil driven by an amplifier with usually around 10 watts output. So I had a jukebox amplifier, a Packard Play More, MOR, Packard Play More jukebox amplifier, which I picked up from an old television repairman back then. And what I did with that is couple the output from the speaker, where a speaker would go, to the cutting cartridge. The cartridge was mounted on a metal 78 RPM record player arm, which was on a record player. It wasn't a record changer, it was a player. And I would hold that thing and try to get it to go across the record as smooth as I can with my hand. That was not easy. And I would speak into the microphone. The microphone was connected to the input of that jukebox amplifier, which normally a crystal cartridge would go to, because that jukebox amp came out of a 78 RPM jukebox of some sort. I have no idea. I got that amplifier by itself. I remember it was painted red. That's the original color of it. And that was part of my stereo system in later years, my first homemade stereo system, using that amplifier and another one, so they weren't matched. But that's another story and another day. So for a short while I did that, but it got too expensive buying those discs, and I wasn't really happy with it. I tried pumping music in it also, but it certainly wasn't very good. When you're cutting records, you got to make sure that your tone arm is good and heavy, because you got to dampen the cartridge. Otherwise, because all your power for the cutting needle is at the needle. But if you have your cartridge too light, your arm, your tone arm, too light, you're not going to get the energy transferred from the needle. It's going to vibrate the whole arm and defeat the purpose. So anyways, that's probably it on that, without boring you on stuff that's old technology. But that's how I learned by that, and from these men that I went to in these TV shops. In later years, probably in 62, I believe, we moved back to New London, Connecticut, and then I met Nate Carver. I have a video on him with those stories he told, and he was like a mentor to me. He was very, very smart. He didn't know what the meaning of soap and water was. And believe me, most of the time his vehicles were not running. He was a TV repairman, but the problem is he took on too much. He wanted money ahead for the parts, and when he'd get a lot of customers mad at him because he wouldn't finish the television, because he used the money, he bought the parts, but then he didn't finish the TV. Because maybe he didn't buy all the parts, and he spent the money in a restaurant somewhere eating. So a lot of times he wasn't driving, or he didn't have gas, so I'd pick him up when I started driving. But before that, he would take me over, and we'd go out for coffee. I'd buy the coffee, and he'd pick me up and bring me back until I started driving. Then I did that for him. So he had a little TV shop over in Groton, Connecticut, which was just over the bridge from New London. And it was called Reaction Research Laboratories of America. Big name, but, he was a Russian Jew. He had huge hands. And I believe somebody had said he wore size 13 shoes. He was only about 5'6", but he was a rugged guy when I met him. He'd bust rock with 20-pound sledge. So he was a pretty strong guy. And we became very good friends. But the problem is, in the summertime, I could not go out with him. It would be... I did do it, but I'll tell you, my eyes burned. That's how bad he smelled, And he lived in an old 1930s school bus in the woods. So he would never want me to come up near there. I'd meet him at his shop. But I got a glimpse from a distance of that school bus, And shortly afterwards, I met that big ironworker, Whitey Polkey. He's the one that built the house out of oak. He was about 6'3" and about 320 pounds. real, don't want to ever get into the bad side of him. And I showed you pictures of that. And him and Nate Carver did not get along. He didn't like him. So there was some problems there, that's for sure. But anyways, Nate Carver got me into my first car, which was a 1950 Studebaker Champion 6-cylinder. Nate Carver is very knowledgeable on auto repair. He taught me how to hone the brake cylinders, how to rebuild the brakes, how to lap the valves in the 6-cylinder engine, and everything. And I did all that under his supervision out in the woods. That's where I got the car. It was on Nate Carver's land. At that time, he owned 11 acres, but he lost it all to taxes because he didn't believe in paying taxes, so he lost all his land in later years. But he taught me how to do that, and I was working on the ground with cardboard down on the ground, mosquitoes buzzing and biting all over the place. It was not easy, but he would pick me up from New London, take me over to Groton, and help me with it. I bought the car from him for $35, and I remember Whitey saying, "You got ripped off. That man ripped you off." And I says, "Whitey, that guy didn't rip me off. He's picked me up every damn day and taken me over there and given me, this was 1962. 63, thereabouts. Somewhere around that time, maybe it was, 64, 64, after my dad died. My dad died in 63. October 20th of 63, he died. So it was 1964, so Nate spent more money taking me back and forth to that car to work on it than that $35 I've ever got. Yes, I put in a lot of money into that car, and it smoked like a banshee. And when I got my driver's license, I drove it, and it smoked like a banshee. I used to use STP in it and use 30-weight recycled motor oil that the Sunoco station sold at that time in New London. I think it was $1.75 for 2-gallon can. And I had the can in the back and the glass bottle. I used to fill it up from the 2-gallon can. I carried that with me in the trunk of this 63 in the 50 Studebaker Champion. That was before I got my 63 Ford Galaxy. So, there's a lot of memories there, but Nate has helped me out a lot on electronics and taught me theory. But the one thing they can never get, and I still can't get to this day, is, and everybody laughs at me, is Ohm's Law. I just can't grasp it. I can't grasp it. I never could. When it comes to math, I just cannot grasp it. You've seen me count on my fingers. In 59, how old was I? I got to count. All right, in 59, it would be, then I'd have to count, all right, let's say 53, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. So add 6 years to that. That's the way I have to count. That's the way I had to do in school. I used the dot system then, on paper. And that's just it. I just can't grasp the math, Even numbers, I have no problem. 10, 20, 30, 40, Anyways, we're getting off the subject, and I'm talking too long here, but I wanted to make a video, and I'm going to try to not bore you too much here. So, before we finish on the video, when we used to go to those movie theaters, mostly in New Haven, when I was living in New Haven, there was quite a few movie theaters. I've been looking on the internet, and I can't seem to find any nice photos of the Paramount Theater in New Haven. That is one of them that I went to a lot. I can't find any photos of the Grand Theater on Grand Avenue in New Haven back in the 50s and 60s. Well, 60s, when that Mayor Lee I was living there at that time. Mayor Lee ruined that city by his so-called redevelopment and tore everything down. The same thing happened here in New London back in the 60s. So it's a damn shame. But the theaters I used to go to mostly was the Grand Theater, which only was 35 cents for kids and 50 cents for adults. 15-cent popcorn. 25-cent ice cream cones, the kind that are in the little, what do you call them? The little cones with the little paper you tear off the top and you eat it. You eat the whole thing. Soda vending machines that will drop down a cup of soda. 8-ounce cup, 10 cents. Carbonated or non-carbonated grape soda. I used to love the non-carbonated grape soda. I love that, you know. There was quite a few theaters. I've seen a lot of movies, horror movies and stuff like that. I used to be into a lot of these horror movies back then. Then there was a lot of small theaters, mom and pop theaters, like the Grand Theater on Grand Avenue in New Haven. That was a mom and pop's theater, and there was a lot of others which I can't offhand think of what they are. Every Saturday I'd go to a movie. Every Saturday I'd get a 15-cent popcorn, because that's what it is. You know, 10 or 15 cents. That's what it was back in those days. Before we moved out of New Haven, some of your theaters charged as much as 90 cents for adults before we moved back to New London. When we moved back into New London in 1962, about that time, because we didn't live in New Haven too long, the Capitol Theater in New London, which is closed many, many years ago, they were $1 for adults. I says, oh wow, they're 10 cents higher than New Haven. In New London at that time, we only had 2 theaters in downtown. The Capitol, which is now long gone, and the Guard Theater, which has been renovated many years ago and is active, but primarily for plays and stuff like that, I guess. But I think it's all closed now. So, and then in those years, I used to work in a hygienic restaurant, as I told you so many times before. Back when coffee was 15 cents. And then it went up to a quarter. And, that's when I started listening to Lee Moore, the coffee drinking Nighthawk on WWVA in Wheeling, West Virginia. So I used to bring my transistor radio there and put it in the kitchen. And when the Jamboree came on a Saturday night, I'd play it in the kitchen. There was a pocket transistor radio, and it came in pretty good, setting it on a metal surface to act as a ground plane, and it would pick up the Wheeling Jamboree. As the evening went on, it came in better. Another time, well, at that same years actually, I got into CB for the very first time in 63, I think it was. About the time, just before my dad passed on, I think in early 63, I got into Citizens Band, and my first base station was a Gonset G11 single-channel base station radio. Then I got ordered from Lafayette Radio Electronics in Syosset, Long Island, HE29B walkie-talkie. Big clunky looking thing. It took 8, I think it took 8 AA batteries. And the kids in the neighborhood, the young fellas my age in the neighborhood, would all have them of one form or another. So, those were the days, and I used to set that on top of the dishwasher machine, which is stainless steel. That acted as a walkie-talkie on that. That acted as a ground plane, and I got out to a base station across the river in one of the, I think it's on the other side of Westerly, Rhode Island. So in a clear night, we didn't have all these war warts and junk like that like they have now. And I could talk to them because they had a base station and a big antenna. So he could hear me. So it was nice. It was a neat little time at that time. But then I got out of CB. It was getting too bad and so forth. And I didn't get back into it till 73. And that's when it was really, really bad. Those days you had to have a license in 60s and the 70s. But I got, there was a lot of problems, a lot of troublemakers. I met some good friends on CB in 73, but the troublemakers were getting too much, and I decided to get out of it. It wasn't worth it. And so that's the end of that. So I think we're going to end this video here. I hope that you got some. I presented some things of interest to you, and I did my best to get some kind of pictures there from all this time talking. So that's it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Take care, everybody.